Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vaga Muradian here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum in Simi Valley, California, where we're covering the Reagan National Defense Forum. Our coverage here is sponsored by Leonardo DRS, and we have the honor of talking to one of America's greatest public servants, a man, George Shultz, who had a distinguished career in academia, in business, and in government. A Marine artillery officer in World War II. After the war, he went to MIT and earned his PhD in economics, and then went on to serve Presidents Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, and George W. Bush, and advised just about every other president since. He is also one of two people who hold the distinction of holding 4 cabinet offices, including Secretary of Labor, the very first Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Treasury Secretary, and Secretary of State. And to boot, in your spare time, sir, you came up with the idea of the G7 group of industrialized nations. It's an honor, Dr. Shultz.
Thank you.
I want to start.
With all that recitation, I'm exhausted.
Well, your accomplishments are incredible, and I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk strategy with you. It's a very, very difficult time. It's a multipolar world. China is rising. Russia continues to provoke. The North Koreans continue to be a challenge, as are the Iranians, as is violent extremism. The Trump administration is trying to wrap its hands around a new national security strategy. In your estimation, what's the right kind of strategy the nation needs at a confused global period, a contested global period like this?
The first step is to understand what's happening. And there are 4 major forces that are reshaping the world fundamentally and rapidly. These are, number 1, the demography of the world is changing very fast. Fertility in most developed countries is very low. Longevity is increasing. The structure of the population is changing. That has big implications. The places where there is rising populations are mostly areas where the economy is not doing well, where global warming is probably going to make life very difficult. So I think it's likely that we're going to see major migration issues. So this is one point. The second is that with the huge communications and information revolutions, governance has become much more difficult because diversity is everywhere. It used to be that people ignored it or suppressed it. Can't do that anymore. So you have to learn how to govern over diversity. And people really haven't figured that out. So we see lots of turmoil. And then you have artificial intelligence, which is rapidly changing the way tasks get done of all kinds. And when you combine that with 3D printing, which really should be called additive manufacturing, you can build almost anything. You can build things that will upset security, and can build things that you can produce most of the things you want near where you are. So that means a big economic revolution. So I think we have to study these trends very carefully and try to understand them and see where they go and figure out how we manage them, and then design a strategy for the United States in that light.
Let me ask you about that. As you said, part of strategy and deterrence is understanding your adversaries very, very clearly. In the Cold War,
but also your friends.
And also your friends, exactly, what makes them tick. And I have a question on that for you as well. But I want to start with the strategic approach to deterrence. During the Cold War, we spent an enormous amount of time and effort studying the Soviets. And yet, in 1983, we came as close as we ever did to nuclear war in the Able Archer exercise, where the Russians, in part, were very much concerned with President Reagan's rhetoric, saw that exercise as a prelude to a preemptive attack. After that, you helped convince President Reagan to open a dialogue with the Soviets. Did you feel that during the Cold War, we understood the Soviets as well as we needed to understand them? And do we now understand the Chinese, the Russians, Tehran, or Pyongyang, and what's truly motivating them to craft the smartest strategies to deter them or to advance our interests?
Well, let me go back to the Cold War part. President Reagan understood the Soviets well. And he understood that they could change under the right circumstances. There were lots of people in our administration that didn't agree with that. So it was a continuing battle. Lots of people thought they wouldn't change. Detente, that is, they're here, we're here, that's life, get along. He rejected that. They can change. And then we had a moment when We deployed intermediate range missiles, particularly the ballistic missiles in Germany called the Pershings.
Right.
That was a huge thing. The Russians walked out of negotiations with the Soviets and they fanned war talk, but our allies held together and we deployed the missiles. I call it a Pershing moment. That was the turning point in the Cold War. Once we established our strength very clearly, I might say force was not used, no shots were fired, strength. Then it was possible to have good talks, and gradually after the Pershing moment, we began to have fruitful discussions. And that was President Reagan's thinking, and that's what he did.
Do you think that we have the proper understanding of China, Russia, Pyongyang, and Tehran to craft the most effective counter strategies to them?
Well, I'm not in the administration, so I'm not privy to how they're thinking about things. But I think that Russia is playing a weak hand aggressively. And we need a Pershing moment. And once we have that, probably we can have more fruitful talks. But until they see that there's a stop sign up there, it's hard to have, they just will continue what they're doing. So we have to have that Pershing moment. And then I think we should be able to have some fruitful talks, and that would be very important to do.
Would that be the same with the Chinese as well, with their island building?
Well, the island building is part of the problem, but the Chinese, at least I know from my own personal experience, how willing they are to talk and to solve problems. And there are plenty of difficulties now, but the president of China has an instinct to talk. Let me give you two examples. I was in China at a Track 2 meeting, and this was before he was president, but everybody knew he was going to be president. He gave a dinner for us, and I sat next to him at dinner. And I knew he was going to Washington. So I said to him, why don't you stop in San Francisco on your way to Washington? We have a Chinese-American mayor, a lot of stuff going on around there. And he said, well, I've already agreed to stop in Los Angeles, so I can't do that. But if I did come to that area, what I'd really like to do is come down to Stanford, because somewhere around Stanford something's going on and I need to find out about it. And you can't just read about it. You got to go there and talk to people and get a feel. I thought, wow, the guy has an instinct. And he knows more than people give him credit for.
What about North Korea? Is deterrence the best strategy, given that it is already a nuclear power?
Well, deterrence is certainly what we have to do, and I think he probably understands that. But it's a very nerve-wracking situation because you really don't have much of an idea what this guy is really like. But I think it's important to be ready to reach out to him, but only from strength. We've had negotiations with him before, and we agree to do something, he agrees to do something, we do it, and he doesn't. So he doesn't keep his word. So it's a very difficult thing to handle.
Let me ask you about the economy. You were an economic advisor to President Eisenhower. You were Secretary of the Treasury for President Nixon. The national debt is rising. It's about to rise even more given the tax plan that's about to be improved, although supporters of it say that'll spur economic activity. Critics say that it won't. How critical a national security challenge is the debt as far as you're concerned, especially at a time when the nation has to spend on military modernization, infrastructure modernization, a population that's living longer fundamentally and living healthier? How big of a challenge is the national debt?
It's an immense challenge. It's our most important problem, and it's not getting attention. Think of it. We have a gigantic debt now. It's getting larger and larger every year. Interest rates are starting to rise. When interest rates were practically zero, there didn't seem any burden. But if they get up to even a modest level like 3 or 4%, the burden of the debt will be 7, 8, 9% of the budget. And with the continuing spending on the entitlement programs, there's not going to be any room for anything else pretty soon. So we've got to face up to this problem. And what that means is you can't do it by cutting discretionary programs anymore. You have to do something about the entitlement programs. and that's hard. But the Social Security problem is really easy to solve conceptually. It's hard politically. We can solve it conceptually by saying there'll be no change for anybody presently on Social Security, and every new person will get at least as much as the present people are getting, protected by inflation. And all you have to do to make the Social Security system self-sustaining is, number one, change the process of indexing for benefits from wage indexing to price indexing, and raise the age of full benefits to 70 gradually, and you'll get that problem solved. And people are afraid to touch it, but we have to touch it. We have to do it. Now, the last time it was done, Tip O'Neill and the Gipper did it. What did they do? They got a commission appointed. Alan Greenspan was the head of it. And there was a tacit understanding that whatever the commission recommended would go into effect unless one house or the other voted against it. So nobody had to vote for anything. Don't blame me, I didn't vote for it. But it went into effect. So call it a cop-out, but it worked.
I think people ought to be paying a lot more attention to you to get things like this solved. Let me ask you three...
Let me tell you something about the healthcare system. That's the other big entitlement. Here, right now, all people talk about is access to the system. What about the system? Pay a little attention to the system. Here's what's happening. If you decide as a healthcare provider that you'll take Medicare and Medicaid patients, you are inundated with paperwork, as bureaucrats want to be sure you don't engage in any fraud, and they deluge you with paperwork. And you're also subjected to wage and price controls. So what happens? A great many of the healthcare providers are opting out of the system. You don't have to be an economist to know that if you reduce supply and increase demand, you're going to have problems. That's what's happening. And so what to do? Well, you can get some simple, bright people from Silicon Valley, and they'll figure out a system that's not very onerous in paperwork, but does the job. And then eliminate the wage and price controls and say, what about prices? Well, it's easy to fix. Right now, healthcare providers don't tell you in advance what the price is. So get people to say price it, to give you an announced price, any price they want. And give people on Medicaid or Medicare, as well as people who can have a tax thing, access to health savings accounts, so they're spending money. And then there are transactions. As soon as they're real transactions, prices get under control pretty fast. It happens everywhere. It happens with groceries, it happens with computers, it happens with automobiles, it can happen with knee replacements or anything else.
Let me ask you a diplomacy question. You were one of the most admired secretaries of state. You relied very heavily on both on the civil servants, but also on the Foreign Service when you were in as Secretary of State. It's sort of a two-part question. Part one of the question is, how dangerous are the State Department cuts that are happening right now? And the second part is, how important is hard power to successful diplomacy?
Well, you have to bargain from strength. But the Foreign Service officers are terrific people. They're smart, they've studied, they're experienced. And I found, going back when I was Secretary of Labor, people said it's impossible for a Republican because the Labor Department's a wholly owned subsidiary of the AFL-CIO. But I found if you give them professional leadership, they'll knock their stumps out for you. And I found the same thing in OMB, I found the same thing in the Treasury, and the same thing in the State Department. The people are there because they want to serve. And you give decent leadership and they will work hard for you. So I think that the Foreign Service is a wonderful thing to build on, and the civil servants who are there. And we should be keeping them and also bringing young people in. The number of people applying has gone way down, I understand. And that's the future. So you've got to build that. So you work with people who are there, and the fact of the matter is, at least in my experience in 4 different departments, that if you give good leadership, they will respond.
Who was the greatest president you worked with or worked for?
Well, I worked for President Eisenhower, but I was kind of remote. But I was very close to both Nixon and Reagan. They both were strategists. We did some great things in both cases, but I loved President Reagan. He was wonderful. And he was much more deeply thoughtful about what was going on than most people give him credit for. He was a magnificent president. When he took office, inflation was out of control. The economy was going nowhere. The Cold War was as cold as it could get. When he left office, inflation was under control, the economy was going fine, and the Cold War was all over but the shouting. That's a pretty good record.
How do you respond to people who compare President Trump to President Reagan?
No comparison at all. People forget President Reagan was governor of California for 8 years. California, in case you haven't noticed, is a big state, and it has great diversity in it. So the experience of being governor of California is a great basis to go and be president of the United States. People put him down as a movie actor. Well, actually, that's not a bad experience, because what you learn is how you get something across to people. And that's a pretty good thing to know how to do, which he did.
And he was a consummate gentleman always.
Always wonderful to work with. And Nancy was something else too. She was wonderful. She always fixed me up with a Hollywood starlet for White House dinner, so I got to dance with Ginger Rogers and stuff like that.
And last question. Can I ask a Marine question? It's an
Ask
incredible
a Marine
honor.
question.
Huh?
Ask me about the Marine Corps.
Well, why did you choose the Marine Corps, and what did your Marine service mean to you?
The Marine Corps is a wonderful group of people who are brothers. We're a team. All Marines feel together. And the World War II broke out, and so I wanted to be in the service, and we had, that time Guadalcanal was going on. That turned out to be the turning point. And the Marines were magnificent there, so I said, that's my kind of outfit. So I joined the Marines, and I learned a tremendous amount. For example, I remember in boot camp, the sergeant hands me my rifle. He says, take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. Remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats. Boot camp wisdom. That has great meaning. I told that story to President Reagan, and he followed that. We were very careful. You mean what you say, and people get used to that. Then I remember early on, we had just gone overseas, and I hadn't been in much combat, but we were starting to have some. And as in most cases, I had a sergeant that I thought became a good friend. He was a wonderful guy, talented and just first class in every way. And we had action going on, and I was looking around for him, and I ran over where I thought he might be. I said, where the hell is Patton? Patton's dead, sir. I'll never forget that moment. And you learn that wonderful people get killed in war. So if you're ever in a position to advise the president on using force, remember Patton. Be sure your mission is a good mission. Be sure you equip people to win. You go someplace to accomplish something, so you want to fix it so that they can accomplish what they set out to accomplish. And so I always remember Patton. Then another occasion, we're on an island. We had taken this island. There was an island nearby where the natives were, and they made grass skirts and log canoes and things. The Marines liked to go by them. So we had a deal where the Marines could go over there for 2 hours. And I went over and I watched. And the natives, they enjoyed bargaining. And the Marines wanted to make deals. Guess what happens to the prices? So I stepped in, I said, look, set a price and then they can decide whether to buy it or not. But I always remember that. The guy who wants a deal too much is going to get his head handed to him every time. So I'm testifying before Congress, and they're asking me, aren't I worried I haven't made a deal with the Soviet Union yet? And I said, I'm not interested in deals. I'll make a deal when there's a good deal. Not to them, but I'm not the guy looking for a deal. I think it's a very important, deep lesson I learned from the Marine Corps.
Sir, it's one of the greatest honors of my career. Thank you for your lifetime of service to the nation, and look forward to having another conversation with you.
Okay, great.
And you have a great birthday, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.